It's 5:30, so I wanted to go ahead and start off the Restoration Advisory Board meeting for the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base. Let me turn first to our co-chairs, Matt Mars, the Air Force co-chair, and Arnie Lurich, the community co-chair, for any welcoming remarks. Matt, would you like to start?
Okay. Welcome everyone for coming out, especially those that came on down to the GAC treatment plant site walkthrough a little bit ago. You know, before we start off this meeting, let's just have sort of a moment of silence before we kick it off.
Okay.
Especially those, I have cousins live down in Costa Rica, and they were sending up pictures of the volcanic activity in Guatemala this week. There's a lot of stuff going on around the world. So let's just take a moment of silence before we get started.
Great. As if on cue.
Okay.
Great. All right. Well, Arnie, would you like to offer some welcoming remarks?
I can't top that. Thank you. I want to appreciate and express my appreciation for the RAB members. We had a meeting about 3 weeks ago, and they're helping me as a co-chair to bring more priority to their input to what we're doing here at the meetings and what was going on behind the scenes. And there's a lot of significant things and discussions, and you saw some of it out there, and that's a great, for the rally, to bring more input in the community, and then through the RAB members, please talk to them. Find out who they are, meet them tonight, and then start communicating with them what your concerns are, so they can bring it out here at the meetings in the technical side of it. I want to also reiterate something I mentioned last meeting, and that is a motto. And if in everything we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendship? And is it beneficial to all concerned? And if we all start that way in any of our dialogues, it'll bring us a lot quicker to the solutions. Thank you.
Great.
I have one last thing.
You bet.
And I want to acknowledge OWA and the township for all the work that they've been doing, working with us on getting this easement on through on the GAC treatment plant. So thanks, Gary. Is Aaron here?
Aaron's in the
Is
back
it
here.
behind the ladder?
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Great.
Appreciate all your hard work. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you. I also, before we do introductions, I want to just acknowledge some representatives of legislators as well. We have Jake Bennett, representative, U.S. Representative Kildee. Thank you, Jake. Great. Also, we have Eric Keller, who represents U.S. Senator Peters. Thank you. Are there other state or federal legislators who are represented here tonight that we ought to recognize at the moment? Okay, well, thank you for your presence, gentlemen. Let me ask the RAB members to introduce themselves. Chris, I'll start with you, if you don't mind. We'll go around this way.
I'm Christina Bush. I'm a toxicologist with Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. That's the state health department.
I'm Tim Cummings. I'm from the Oscoda Township Board of Trustees.
I'm Bob Delaney. I'm from DEQ, project manager for the state.
Bill Gaines. I'm a community representative and a member of the Oscoda area school board.
Hi, Martha Gottlieb, and I'm a community member, and I'm sitting in, I'm an alternate. I'm sitting in for Matt Hagwood, so I'm a primary tonight.
Chuck LaShawn, District 2 Health Department.
Tony Martolio, District Ranger, the Huron Shores Ranger District of the Huron-Manistee National Forest.
Joe Maxwell, community member and head of the Oscoda DDA.
Daniel Stock, community member alternate, sitting in for Ryan Mertz.
Matt Mars, Air Force BRAC.
Arnie Lurich, co-chair on the community side.
Mike Munson, I'm a board member of the Oscoda Wurtsmith Airport Authority.
Joe Plunky, I live on the lake. Community member.
Thank you.
My name is Jerry Schmidt. I'm an attorney. I'm from East Tawas, Michigan, and I am a community member.
Robert Tazier, I am a community member and vice chairman of the Oscoda Township Planning Commission.
Kathy Woosterbarth. I'm a community member and a co-lead of the Now Meet Our Water Community Action Group.
Great, thank you. Are there other alternate community members, alternate community RAB members? Yes, ma'am, if you could introduce yourself, then we'll turn to you, sir.
Catherine Larry, community member.
Dan O'Connor, community member. Thank you.
Irene Dunn, community member.
Thank you, Irene. Okay. Well, let me also ask that we all try to emulate Robert Tasher with a loud speaking voice. Many of those who are at the back have the detriment of not being able to hear too well. So let me ask the RAB members to really speak up and project if at all possible. The good news is that y'all are closest to the refreshments, though, so it balances out. Good. Okay, well, let me ask our technicians to advance us to the next slide, and actually on to slide 3 as well. I just wanted to give this kind of brief overview of the agenda. Again, my name is Tim Sultan-Foss. I serve as the facilitator and just help with the meeting process here. We also have Brianne Humphreys, who's taking minutes of our discussions. The first portion of the meeting is the welcome. So we're in that portion now. Then we'll move into a stakeholder updates portion, in which we'll be providing just updates of activities that have occurred since the last meeting. We'll move into a few different presentations. We'll talk about sharing and using data, the SSI, supplemental site inspection, the granular activated carbon treatment system. We'll talk about the fish contaminant monitoring program. We'll move into the RAB business section then. We'll talk about how the minutes of the 18 April Restoration Advisory Board meeting were finalized. We'll look at the action items, talk about the next date for our RAB meeting, and then we'll have a period of public comment period. So anyone who is interested in making a public comment towards the end of our meeting, right over there, sir, if you could just raise your hand. Exactly, right there are some public comment sheets that you can fill out, and then also a sign-in sheet right there. So please, if you're interested in coming up and speaking for 3 minutes, please just sign up on that sign-in sheet as well. And then just the last comment, please, everyone, do sign in, not on that sheet, but on the ones further back behind you as well. Great. All right, any other administrative items from the co-chairs before we roll through? Okay. Well, let's move to the next slide then, the ground rules. Good. And let me ask, we started with Chris earlier, so we'll try it this side. Kathy, do you mind starting us off with reading ground rule number 1?
Respect one another and maintain an atmosphere of open dialogue and exchange of ideas.
Use our time together efficiently, wisely, and respectfully.
All right, yes, sir. Number 3.
Speak clearly and succinctly, one person at a time, avoid interrupting others.
Thank you, sir.
Number 4, listen and remain open to differing points of view.
Maintain a propensity of progress, prepare, discuss, document, and move forward.
Share information early, openly, and honestly.
Accurately and objectively relay to others the discussions that occur at board meetings.
Okay, so RAB members, do those ground rules still work? Great. Okay. Well, my job is to make sure that we conduct our meetings in accordance with those ground rules. So I'm going to do that till you love me or you hate me, but I'm going to try to keep us on that topic as well. Well, so let's move into the next slide if we could. So this is an update portion, and actually moving on to slide 6 as well. We'll start with stakeholder updates. And again, this is the intent here is brief informational updates, specifically any items that have occurred since the last meeting, which was April 18th. And any more detailed information will occur further down the agenda in some of the presentations that we have. But let's see, Bob Delaney submitted a few items from MDEQ. So Bob, would you like to just update us on your bullets there?
Sure, and I assume you're going to speak too, right, Chris? As long as you steal her thunder. couple things that have occurred recently out at Clark's Marsh. We, the DEQ had deer taken, so they took about 20 deer from the Clark's Marsh area to be analyzed for PFAS.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Sure. So one of the things that's occurred is this spring, the DEQ had some professional hunters go out and take about 20 deer from the Clark's Marsh area to be analyzed for PFAS. I don't know if you've heard when the results will come back. Have you yet?
The results are expected in fall.
Okay. We're also contracting to have a pilot test on capture of foam coming, that's coming up on your beaches and stuff. We're going to try and get that foam off. I'm going to be giving an update later, so I'll go over these things. And then we recently went out and did more residential well sampling, and I will do an update on that as well.
Great. All right. Thank you. Okay. Air Force. Matt, would you like to provide a brief update?
Okay, this one, the drinking water monitoring program, have the two individuals that have been sort of spearheading that. Just raise your hands. But AMEC's been doing that. AMEC Wood has been doing that, and it's captured on your slide number 15. And I think you guys just recently finished that.
We're, at this point, we've collected 29 samples from different residents, and we have 9 that we're still, seasonal people that we're still trying to get in touch with and collect samples from them.
Okay. And those results, we will probably see them in the...
Yeah, we're looking at, probably 4 weeks or so to get results, and then we'll make the balance.
So hopefully we'll have all that data, by the next RAB meeting. So, because it takes a while to get the lab validation.
And again, it is somewhat hard to hear, so let me ask that we cease any additional conversation in the audience, but also if y'all are unable to hear, if you could just raise your hand, and we'll try to remind ourselves to speak up on that. Okay, Mr. Munson with the Airport Authority.
Yes. I'll speak loud so everyone can hear me, because I have some positive news to talk about. I'll talk about the diamond that the Air Force left us. That's the airport. The Airport Authority has the responsibility to make the airport a positive impact on the community. Just to give you some background, the airport has 11,800 foot by 200 foot ILS equipped runway. What that means, it's basically full service, like what you'd see down at Detroit Metro. It's going to be reconstructed this summer using federal, state, and local airport monies. It has about 9,000 operations a year. It's a busy place. So it's got a positive impact on the community. Just to give you some details, we've got about 26 businesses on the airport property, employing 1 to as high as 700 employees, with a grand total of about 1,900 people. There's about a 14% growth year over year. Just to put it in perspective, it's about the employment folks out there number about 25% of the Oscoda Township population. So it's a big impact, big positive impact. There's going to be a slide that basically coming up in a minute. We're looking at 2 possible new hangars.
Let's advance 2 slides to the next one.
Which are the two hangars right there. These are the other 2, 9 and 8, are currently in operation. Again, it's a busy place. I don't have the exact numbers, but those 2 hangars that are there right now are probably booked for the next year and a half. So we are eventually looking at possibly building 2 new hangars. But before that happens, we have to have an environmental impact study. And that's going to take place this summer. make sure that, that we know the soil content. And it's called the Brownfields Redevelopment Program, and I'd like to thank Bob and your group at DEQ for spearheading and basically helping us getting these funds to make that happen. Again, some positive activity going on in the area.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move back one slide to slide 7, then, if we could. And Ms. Bush with DHHS. Provide an update.
Sure. Bob already alluded to the resampling efforts that occurred in the Colbath neighborhood and in the River Road Pinecrest neighborhood. That's the neighborhood across from the school. The results are back on that. I am calling some people because we have a delay in updating our letters. I'm trying to let people know by phone, but if you have been resampled, and your well has been resampled in those areas, I do have the results with me tonight, so I can show you your results. But essentially, our recommendations do not change. The people in those areas can continue using their wells, except for the one person who had the exceedance in his initial round of sampling across from the school. That was that one address, and that person has already had alternate water. So that's the update on the drinking water. The letters with the results should be coming out to people next week. In regards to the foam evaluation, we are finishing that up. I would think that there are many in this room tonight who are aware of a foam evaluation that was done for the Rogue River in Kent County by the former Wolverine Tannery by the dam that's in Rockford. And I do have a copy of the evaluation that we provided to Kent County Health Department, but you can also access that online to understand how we evaluated that, because we are evaluating the foam at Van Etten Lake in a similar fashion, just doing a rather detailed scientific discussion of it that we provided. We'll provide the same to the district health department. I'll have the fish updates at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you. And if we could move back to slide 7, please. Okay, we also wanted to provide some updates from the community standpoint. Arnie, would you like to start on?
Thank you. I mentioned earlier that the community RAB members met, it was about 3 weeks ago, and we looked at all the issues that we've been working on here as a RAB, and we thought which ones could have the fastest action and be completed and shared, and which ones would also have the most meaningful benefit if it was done quickly. And that topic bubbled up to the one that I mentioned at last meeting, is the release of the MDEQ report on what I call the plume monitoring or plume modeling. That was completed, my understanding, last August, and is been under management review, and then recently was reported out last month that it's going for a consultant's expert review right now. The reasons that that report is so important is because, well, first off, we'd like to know when it's going to be, because we didn't have that, when it's going to be released. The other thing is the impacts are on the primary reasons for this RAB and topics, and those are remediation and moving it forward as fast as possible and complete as possible, and also health effects. The health effects come from the hydrant data that was done 2 years ago by the DEQ, which found the potential or probability, I don't know which, of the water system on the base when it was active having some PFAS, significant PFAS contamination. The vets were drinking that, the citizens also were drinking it for another 4 years after the base closed. So those people want to know, were those plumes there, how concentrated, and so forth. The other thing is remediation. That study is meant to show where the plumes are now and where are the contaminants coming from. And in the fairness of sharing and the responsibility of sharing data between the DEQ and the Air Force, that report holds significant information, and it must be shared as soon as possible. So I hope that that's going to be an action item at the end of this meeting. I'd like to turn over to Kathy, who's going to talk about our community outreach effort that went on earlier this evening.
Okay, thanks. Yep, if you were here earlier, the community members organized a rally to show their community engagement and their requests for action. We have growing membership with the Now Need Our Water group. We're collaborating around the state with statewide efforts with similar groups like Rockford and Grand Rapids area and Grayling. We're also demanding the release of the study by the ATSDR that has been suppressed and that will likely show evidence for the lowering of safe PFAS levels and greatly impact the process that we're in right here.
Well, thank you very much. So that was helpful just to, I think, as a standing item to receive some brief updates and then have time to go in more depth into some of the agenda topics that we have. It is the time on the agenda now to move into a joint Air Force MDQ presentation about the use of data and investigation and interim mitigation activities. This relates to a future agenda item that we had set at the last meeting, I believe it was, to describe how the Air Force incorporates, reviews, and utilizes data generated by MDQ or other agencies. So, Bob and Matt, how would y'all like to proceed on that one?
Oh. Well, yeah, they want to know how you're using our data, and so maybe you can start off with that, and then, or I can tell them what data we get.
And if we could advance
All
to
right.
slide 9, please.
Okay, let's just go on slide 9. Basically, a lot of this goes back to the data that's collected on both sides and what we discuss in our BCT meetings, which is the Bright Cleanup Team meetings. And, you know, going down through it, just basically touching on those same points, it's always approved data through the controlled methods. And the collection of this data is critical in the understanding of the groundwater profile, and it's critical in making the decisions on the mitigation systems and, you know, that can be used effectively to protect the drinking water. And, you know, going into that, we'll talk about it more with the discussions that we've been going through with the DEQ recently on our SSI objectives, which is the protection of the drinking water receptors and, you know, the investigation of the drinking water pathways. But this was items that we discussed back in April and then mid-May, and then there was discussion yesterday. But there'll be more information on that as we go through our presentations. So.
Thank you. Bob, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, as far as data, historically the Air Force has gathered almost all the data for the site, and we, under the grant, can sample up to 10% of what the Air Force does. So they're going out and doing 10 wells. I can sample one to duplicate what they're doing, and it's check, you know, that their lab is working, and a variety of other things that we look at as regulators. And then the other thing that's happened is over the years, my management has always given me a pot of state money, because under the federal grant, I cannot do original work. So if I say to the Air Force, for instance, I'm concerned about this PFAS, and they can't, you know, go forward and sample for it, the state's always given me a little money to go out and do sampling for it. Essentially, it's meant to screen the site, see if the site has a particular problem. So I've always been getting data in, and I share all that data with the Air Force. And since, and so it was not, the work we did in the past was called, I always called it screening work, because to do proper sampling, and Matt was alluding to it, you have to do certain quality control type things to make sure that you're not introducing contamination in the field, you are not, the lab isn't messing up. There's all these things you're supposed to do, and we never had the kind of money to go into those kind of studies, and we didn't really need to. I just needed to tell the Air Force, hey, you spending on. In recent years, because the plumes are much bigger than was apparent, things are off the base. We've found drinking water problems on the east side of Van Etten Lake, an area we had never looked at before. We knew that the fish might be a problem, and so we've continued to take our 10%, and actually much less than that, sampling that the federal government will pay for, and done sampling alongside them to make sure they're still doing their job. But we've also gone out and done all your residential well sampling that you are doing. That's done with state funds. All the investigations, those of you who are familiar with Mike Jury, that's Saginaw Bay District area. All that work that's being done by Mike when he's out in your yard drilling a hole and looking to see what's contamination. A lot of surface water, the foam sampling, all that is done with state taxpayer money. That's not paid for by the federal government. Now we share all that data with the Air Force, and we're doing the quality control stuff that we need to do now, for whether we go to court or they can base their remedial decisions on quality, that data has the quality control that it needs to have. So we share all that data with them on a fairly regular basis, and then it's somewhat confusing here. They still are only accepting the contamination on the base and slightly off the base. They're not accepting, or they haven't said emphatically, no, it's not our contamination on the east side of Van Etten Lake. But you won't ever see any of their maps showing plumes on the east side of the lake or in the Oscoda River or any of that. When you see my maps, you'll see all that. So they're not using that data at this time. The data that I collected originally is screening data to just force the Air Force to deal with a problem. They've used that because they've gone out and they know they have a PFAS issue and they're sampling and they're doing all the things they're doing. So it's accomplished what I intended that data for, and they've used it in the way I expected them to use it. They aren't using our data that's on the east side or in other areas, or the fish data, or the surface water data. So I haven't seen those things being put on any of their maps, but they get it all.
In just a minute, I'll ask the RAB members if they have any questions on this topic. But Matt, was there anything else you wanted to cover on this before we just open it up to questions?
Not at this time, because we're going to get into the SSI objectives and discussion in just a minute.
Exactly.
But as Bob alluded to, yes, there is a grant. It's through, it's called Desmoa. And, the Air Force sends the state monies for additional sampling up to 10% and things of that. And we're just fixing to get into the next cooperative agreement period on that, which starts in 1 July.
So it sounds like
we'll work
this next
closely together.
Supplemental site inspection topic may address some questions, but before we move there, let me just ask the RAB members if there are questions that they have based on this update.
Oh, the other thing too is that the Air Force is taking, you all know by now that PFAS and PFOA are the two chemicals that are regulated, that we have a criteria for. The federal government has a health advisory number for as far as what is considered safe in drinking water. But the firefighting foam contains a whole list of chemicals, and we're both Air Force and us, when we sample and analyze, we get the data for all those other chemicals. So right now, as a matter of policy, the Air Force only puts on their maps the two chemicals that have a criteria or a health advisory for. They don't put on the maps all of the data that they have. They do put that in the reports, so you can go to the back of the report and you can find out about it. But with our maps and stuff, we always put all the different contaminants on there so that you can see what the total thing is. Like in your residential well, you can see the total suite of chemicals, not just the two that there are right now criteria. So that's another difference in how we use data. So they're aware of it, and as it's believed that there's going to be some more criteria coming out for a couple more chemicals, so they will add those in to their maps and stuff as that comes about.
Great. Okay, question here, Mr.
Yes,
Thatcher.
I have a question. So from what you were saying, that I would like to know then, who is doing the monitoring out at Clark's Marsh? Is it the Air Force or is it the MDEQ?
It's a little of both. They do, you know, they have the pump and treat system out there, and they have a sort of a permit with us. It's not really a permit, but we won't get into the details of that. And under that, they're supposed to continually monitor to make sure that the system is working properly, that it's capturing what it's supposed to capture, and it is discharging safe water that meets the criteria. Anything pretty much, and then they've been doing some more investigation out in that area. So they've been doing other types of sampling and things like that. So they have been. We've been doing the stuff in the marsh actually, you know, checking the water continuously to see if it's improving and things like that. So we've been doing that work.
So is that still considered a secondary source, Clark's Marsh area? I mean,
well, the reality is that the sediments out there are contaminated. So, but they're contaminated by these plumes. So the plumes come in, they pass through the sediments, and they accumulate in the sediments like they accumulate in the fish, and then they continue to bleed off into surface water. So, yeah, it'll be a secondary source. I think in the way that you're thinking into the future, it's one of the questions of how do you deal with that.
bingo.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a difficult question.
And just something to point out, in your packets for the RAB members, there's a questions and answers document. One of those questions and answers pertains to that question, I believe. Mr. Lurich.
Just to clarify, that grant that you get from them, from the Air Force, in addition to sampling and analysis and all that in the modeling studies, you also review the documents that the Air Force uses to recommend solutions and remediation and things like that. So that's a big part of it.
Yeah, that's a primary.
Right.
That's the primary. Yes.
Right,
focus of
and
the
also, and also the environmental management of the state's requirements, you bring that as an expert on that to the Air Force so that they can understand it, and with whatever enforcement or authorities you have, you're letting them know that ahead of time. The amount I've heard is $500,000 a year. Is that accurate?
That's been around that for the last several years. This last year was maybe $700,000 a year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, sir.
What needs to happen to establish responsibility for the pollution that's off of the bounds that are immediately contiguous to the air base? That is the stuff that's over at the school, the stuff that's on the other side of Van Etten, the stuff that's even out towards Lake Huron, that those of us that live here have no concept of what other possible source could lead to that pollution if it isn't
So,
Wurtsmith.
the question is, what's the process by which you determine the source of the contamination?
And then accept responsibility for the fact that the water bodies are, to my presumption, not blocking the passage as was initially presumed.
Matt, are you able to respond to that question? Kind of how do you determine the source and the responsibility?
As we move forward through this whole process, yes, those will be items that will be addressed before we get through this, and that's the reason I'm not going to say the process that we follow, because I've had too many people say, don't mention that acronym again. But as we go through that process, yes, before it's all over and said and done, yes, all of that will be addressed.
And I'll give you there's two things. In the process that the Air Force is following, it is required of them to find the full extent of contamination, full nature and extent. So that means that until they come to the end of where their plume is, they're not done. They have to keep stepping out. So eventually the question of, is that contamination on the other side of the lake? Did it go under the lake? Is it coming from the lake? Is it airborne from the base? There's several hypothesis out there. We scientists talk in hypotheses of how it got over there. And then you test those hypotheses with different types of investigations. So DEQ has been doing a lot of that work as far as looking at how it might have gotten over to the other side. You know, the foam, for instance, the foam shows up on the lake, it blows across the lake. Is that getting it over on the east side? We don't know, but there are several possible mechanisms to do that. Either that or there's another source on the other side. And that, again, you simply have a hypothesis of how it would get there. And I'm not going to get into all the details how we scientists, geologists do that, but we then go out and test that. The only question is how long before the Air Force can get to that? How pressing is that issue? Is DEQ going to continue to do the basic science at state expense or not? Those are the questions right now. So it's a challenging question. Well, good one to bring up here for people to understand.
Let's bring up one more challenging question, then we'll move to the supplemental site inspection topic.
Right, I'm just a little bit confused about what we're talking about, because I was told, and people on our road were told over a year ago, that the reason we have filters on our water and stuff is because they could tell that the PFAS that showed up in our water was from the base. So now it sounds like we're saying the Air Force isn't using it. My other question was, why are they not using the test data that you guys do to show that it came over on the east side and River Road and everything? Because, I mean, we've known that for over a year. I don't understand now.
I guess, that's an Air Force question.
So I don't understand that. Can you?
And which side of the lake do you live on?
Well, I'm over on the east. I'm near Lake Huron, so.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, we were told over a year ago that, we were of concern because they found the same chemical that was coming from the
I'm
air
sorry,
is in our water.
Folks are not able to hear. If you
Oh,
could
I'm
speak
sorry.
up just a bit
Yeah.
as well. Thank
So
you.
over, yeah.
Well, let's say this. First of all, the Air Force has never said that. DEQ has said that we believe that contamination comes through the Air Force Base, and one of the points is how can you get such a huge plume without a equally huge source? So that's the challenge, and so it's something that can be determined scientifically, and it just depends on how much work we need to do to get there.
So, but then why
our
aren't-
presumption is that it comes from the Air Force Base, given the size of the plumes.
So that would show up in the test data, and my question is, why isn't the Air Force using the test data that the MDEQ has? Why are you not using that test data?
No, we're using basically our contractor, the Air Force's contractor at this time. And our emphasis is the drinking water receptors on the west side of the lake. Because on the east side of the lake, we've looked at the old USGS surveys that show there's another groundwater divide, and that the groundwater migrates from Cedar Lake down to Van Etten Lake on the east side of the lake. So, but all this will be as we go through more and more of these investigations, SSI investigations. But right now, we're focusing on the west side of Van Etten Lake and the drinking water receptors.
And so, Matt, if I remember right, I think you addressed that somewhat in the discussion on the SSI, the supplemental site inspection
Yes.
as well. Let me suggest we move to that, and then Martha, if that remains a question for you, please voice that question.
I guess my statement is whenever there's found that it's Air Force PFAS in whoever's study, the teams need to get together and figure that out and just address it.
Yeah.
I mean, enough talking. I'm sorry, just do it.
Right. Okay, well,
okay.
if we could advance to slide 10, we'll move into that supplemental site inspection update topic. So Matt, would you like to start us off?
Okay, we'll get it. Stepping back to the last time we met was on the 18th of April. The next day we met with MDEQ to talk about the additional SSI objectives. And then from that, we looked at, the SSI objectives with the emphasis on the protection of drinking water receptors and investigation of the drinking water pathway. And then also identification of mitigation needed to protect the drinking water. And with that, we were looking at adding back into our SSI objectives the areas 4 and 6, which is along F41. Because
Slide
that,
11, please.
yeah, might as well just jump onto that. And it was adding back into some areas because we were looking at 1, 2, and 15. And we went and said, okay, we're also going to look at these others. So we look along F41 with the emphasis of the SSI objective right now is on the west side of Van Etten Lake and the drinking water receptors. So, and that's going back to that slide, the focus right now is protection of drinking water. And as we move along, the SSI will provide recommendations for the mitigation needed to assure the drinking water wells remain below the HA for PFOA and PFOS. And then also touching on the SI inspection, basically that report we hope to have finalized. We talked about it yesterday at our BCT meetings. But going down to your last bullet, and you know, the SSI, it does more than just information gathering, because we also have the hydraulic profiling tool, and that's what we're going to look at throughout the SSI work for the areas 1, 2, 4, 6, and 15 throughout this process. But you know, this will help
Slide
to
11.
determine the mitigation efforts, the best ones to implement
Sorry, slide 12.
as we move forward.
Slide 12.
And you know, what we will also do, say in the area, okay, now you can see the area 4 and 6 is also evaluate the down gradient pathway for PFOA, PFOS, the other side of F41. And to also, you know, you collect your additional hydrogeologic data to better understand the aquifer characteristics and groundwater flow. And then also that helps with your interim action alternatives. So that will be what we'll be looking at in the next phases. And then also part of the process was we'll put in additional vertical aquifer sampling locations. Originally it said 4, we've upped that to 6 along in that area. And we'll let our contractor talk about that because they've been in the process of getting approval with some of the owners to put in those VAS sampling points and potential monitoring wells. And then also, you can't quite see it on that map, but your Area 5, which was the former DRMO, which is your Defense Reutilization Marketing Office. They're started looking, reevaluating the data there. Even though it's not a drinking water source, it's upgrading it from the camp up there, the YMCA camp. And also adjacent to that, the DRMO is the landfill 3031, which we're doing an out-of-cycle project right now for the feasibility and action alternatives on that, because we hope to press forward and try to get something put into place. We're starting with this piece of it this year, an out-of-cycle project, but then try to get the rest of that funded in 19. And that's quite a pricey piece of work to do up at landfill 3031. But, you know, as we move forward, we'll be looking and doing a lot of hydrogeologic investigation using the HPT throughout those areas, 1, 2, 4, 6, and 15, and started updating the groundwater monitoring as well, and see about breakthrough and capture with not only the aero and benzene, but the Mission street pump and treat. And as it talked about down there when we did the GAC plant walkthrough at 5 o'clock today, the next phase will be in 19, and that's to tie the Mission Street in. because you guys saw, we're just taking half that big building, which will treat 500 gallons per minute. So as we move forward, we're going to be, as we put this tie the mission in, we're going to look a lot at resin and other treatment technologies, which sort of brings up, we have different groups come to talk to us all the time about different technologies and everything. And here's one I'll pass around to the members to sort of look at. That's a sort of a bentonite mat material. So we're looking at, they were talking about maybe using that as sort of a pre-treatment like at FTO2. Because we're going to have to do something at FTO2 because we're changing out the GAC there around every 80 days. And that's way too often to be changing out the GAC tank. So if we can put a resin technology coupled with a GAC technology. So as we talked about it yesterday, I was telling Bob, we're going to have quite frequent BCT meetings over the next year or so as we move forward with these SSI objectives and as we move forward and looking more at the mitigation activities that we go with. So, you know, just going down through that, and basically I will point out our contractor over there that's actually doing the field work again, if they want to sort of, if you want.
And Beth, if you could come up here, if you don't mind, just so you'll be near a microphone. This is Beth Flynn with AMEC.
I'll just give you a couple of little updates about where we are right now. I think as Matt was saying, we were working in several of the areas, and we started our work had row rig out here on May 21st. So we've been working with the DEQ closely, the Air Force and MDQ, working very closely to get approval of our plans quickly. So it's really appreciated. We gave them a draft plan, it was approved. For us to go ahead and start even before we had final approvals. We were still discussing certain things, but we had approval for those areas that Matt was talking about. Areas 2, which is, Sean is doing the points back there, that's area 2, and area 7, which is right here. And as we go further over, that's the base operations area. And we talked to the former assistant fire chief today. And as part of that, when we were discussing that with him, he did indicate that they had and confirmed that they did do some testing weekly in that area. And so that really is a good reason why we're detecting some of the things we are in that area. So that was really good information to get. And so we're moving forward with that. We're working in that area. And then also area 15, doing some additional work there to look at the sources. So in the time since we met the last, which was in April, we've gotten these plans approved. We've gone out and we've collected 21 samples from 21 locations in that 2, 7, 1, and 15 area. We've collected 21 locations, 59 samples, and those are all being analyzed right now. So that's going to give us some of that good information, data that we need to look at areas that are not captured. The light green area, that's the area where the groundwater is being captured right now and treated, and will be treated as part of the GAC plant. But we know that there's areas outside of that. So that's where we're collecting data to better understand those areas outside of that, what's happening outside of those capture areas that are being currently captured by the treatment system. And then Matt brought up areas 4 and 6. Those are the areas up there towards the north. When we did our initial SI back in 2016, we did see that there was a plume that was coming off of that area as well. And there are some potential drinking water receptors that are out on the other side of F41 there. So part of what we're going to be doing now, and we're out right now getting permission from people to put some sampling, do some sampling in that area. So we'll be doing more of that vertical aquifer sampling there, and also putting in some monitoring wells so we can monitor longer term what's happening in these areas where there are residents and there are potential people still using drinking water in those areas from wells. So we'll be there. That's the work we're gonna be doing from 4 and 6 that Matt was talking about. So down gradient of that area towards the Van Eden Lake. And then, as he also said, we're talking to some people to get permission to also sample on the other side of F41. So we're gonna be also doing some vertical aquifer sampling and some monitoring well installations there. So we haven't started that yet, but we're moving along, doing a lot of work right now. And I think everybody's appreciated how quickly we're able to work and get those through.
And as we move forward, we're probably
Grab that
going
mic,
to-
Matt, if you don't mind.
Okay. As we move forward, we're going to also look at updating this map because there's a groundwater divide that runs through the base right along that area. And we're going to show the groundwater flow on that side is headed towards Van Etten Lake. On this side, the non-drinking water receptor is headed more towards Clark's Marsh in the Oscoda. So we're trying to make it a more user-friendly map as we go forward. And also, we're going to have another map which will show all the IRP sites to help people sort of understand it as we move forward.
Shall we advance to slide 13?
Yeah. And,
Slide 13, please.
Slide 13, we pretty much got that through that talked about this, that areas 4 and 6, and the objectives of that study are going to evaluate down gradient extent, looking at cleaning the vertical occupancy in the wells, and also at that same time we'll be collecting additional hydrogeologic data, so we'll be trying to better understand the groundwater flow, where is it heading, and now we'll have wells that we can monitor right within the area off base with down gradient of areas 4 and 6, and also area 1 and 2 and 7. And we're going to, it says there, for potential coordinate samples. We're going to be putting in these wells that we can sample, so we'll be able to see if there's any trends, what's happening. Are the concentrations getting higher or are they getting lower? So that's going to be good information to better understand the issues. And then the next slide.
Slide 14, please.
This is area 5, which is the DRMO, which is where they, I don't know if you know what DRMO is, probably a lot of you don't know what it is, but
The DRMO, that's where they would take the old government equipment, that they decommissioned it, and they would send it off rail car or whatever to sell it. But that's where you would always go and find it for resale, but it was, they would get rid of the excess equipment there, the old DRMO, as they call them. It might also point to where landfill 3031 that I talked about, when I talked about area 5 earlier too. But that's where we have a out cycle project in 18, and then moving on into the bigger projects in 19, which is quite pricey in that area.
So, with the DRMO, that was an area identified because of that storage, it's stored, at various times. It became a site, and during the 2016 investigation, we sampled, we did see some detections in groundwater at that area, did some additional work, and we're going to be reviewing that work and also confirming that there are no down drinking water receptors in that area. We have not identified any as of yet, but as part of this work that we're doing right now, we're going to revisit that to make sure and see if there's any additional work that needs to be prioritized in that area. Right now, we're not aware of drinking water receptors, but again, we're going to look at that to make sure that if there are any issues, they are prioritized. So I think that's the last of where we are. We're in the middle of sampling, and we're going to continue on. The other activity that Matt mentioned that we're working on is the quarterly sampling. We gave a little bit of update in the beginning for that. We contacted residents, arranged sampling the week of May 14th. We started the work. We sampled 29 residents at this point. There's 9 that we're still trying to coordinate for sampling. And we expect to hopefully get it done by the next week or so if we can coordinate with everybody, but there may be a few stragglers that get passed on a little bit later until we can reach those people. And then expect again to have the results in 4 to 6 weeks. We'll have to do some validation of the data, and then they'll be released to the homeowners, and we'll be able to start this process of looking at any trends that are happening with, people's private wells, concentrations in groundwater. So, thank you all.
Great. Well, the co-chairs have your best interests in mind. They've just suggested a break for some Oreos and so on. Let me ask, how about we take one question from Mr. Gaines? We'll take our break, we'll come back and hit additional questions about this
Okay,
topic.
we've heard a lot of talk and some pointing about DRMO and LF 30 and 31. LF 30 and 31 is at least on our project site. There's nothing about DRMO on our project site. And the map that identifies things has neither of those areas identified, nor do these tiny maps have anything written on them to identify. We again have a continuing action item to make the maps readable, legible, and give information. For me personally, this does not quite meet that criteria.
Well, that's the reason I brought up, we're gonna try to make it more user-friendly.
Oh,
Showing the
good.
groundwater
Thank you.
divides, and then also having a map that shows all the IRP sites with their name on there. That way you have that sort of in your cheat sheet.
Yeah.
Of things, exactly, because I was showing that to Arnie right before the meeting, so we'll make sure to get you that. And as we work on these other maps to try to start making it more user-friendly, so.
And Mr. Gaines, it sounds like you're hoping for more information on that, like Matt was discussing, but also just in the visual presentation of it to make it more visible. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, if I were, as a presenter, doing a slide, I would have made the slide with the map a full slide. And the words a full slide, or something so that the scale is such that it's truly legible.
Okay.
So I would think what needs to be done, either they have to be clearer, more sharper, or they gotta be bigger.
Yeah.
Basically 4 by each sheet of plywood would be very helpful, or they have to be crystal clear when they're on the screen.
Okay.
One of the two.
That's great. Clearer, sharper, and bigger. I like that. Okay, well, let's concentrate here on some Oreos and something to fill our stomachs here. Let's take a 10-minute break. It's 6:28 now. We will come back at approximately 6:38 from our break. So we're on break.
The one flows down this way.
What do you call it again?
But, you know,
The other one flows north and east.
Advance to slide 16, please.
Okay, that's right, yeah.
All right, RAB members, if I could, let me ask you to move on back. If we could all make our way gently back. I appreciate it, thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Right.
I don't want to step on your issues.
Okay, just if I could grab everyone's attention, let me jump in and do jumping jacks or whatever I need to do. Let me ask Matt if we could go ahead and get started as well.
Get started.
Great. Okay, thank you all. Just a check on the agenda. We are now at the Granular Activated Carbon, or GAC, treatment system update. So let me turn back to Matt Mars for the GAC update.
Okay, I appreciate everyone taking the break, and I really appreciate everyone that got here early, and we went down and walked the site, and the contractor's been doing an outstanding job. Greg, before you leave, just let everyone see you one more time. But they worked this past weekend getting that concrete slab in, which I think it was, he said during the visit, that's 20 inches of concrete. So, because there's a lot of heavy items being put there. They've got some more tanks in, so the tanks, they'll start putting up the red iron steel structure this next Monday. So when you drive by, you're going to see a lot of things that have been accomplished there recently. So you can just see some of the pictures as we move along. You know, this time when we met at the April RAB meeting, it was covered with a foot of snow. You see it now, it's moving along. And I hope when we have the RAB meeting, the 15th of August tentatively, that we'll have the ribbon cutting ceremony for it and be able to show it off.
Slide 17, please.
So, yeah, just going down through there, you can see how they've really been pushing it. And they've used local contractors to the max extent, which is good. Always try to help the local economy out. So, and as we've moved along, next slide.
Slide 18, please.
You know, we've had some stoppages along the way because of weather and other things. But what I wanted to do, and that's what I was asking Aaron and Gary with OWA and the township, basically appreciate them working with us as we worked our way through this non-exclusive easement, which is to cover where the pipeline, which we talked about the pipeline to tie in Arrow in the benzene plants. And they're going to go horizontal boring, and they will put that down at 5 foot below grade. That way it's below the other utilities. So they're putting that in, and thanks to the township and OWA, we're working through that, and we have the Air Force legal team right now trying to get the title report and legal descriptions put together to put with that. So, and once we get that, then they'll tie in and put in a new manhole. I think that's been ordered, but that will hold up to 1,000 GPM capacity. Because if you remember looking at the plant, we're only using half the building of that 60 by 120, so there's plenty of room. And as we were having our program management reviews for this next year, just with the program, our managers, which you met, Val Delafuente and Dr. Termuth, they both said, guys, we're going to start looking at resin, we're going to look at other treatment technologies. So that facility's got a lot of room for what we're going to be doing. And also to FTO2, we're going to look at possibly putting resin in conjunction with the GAC. So
Is this a new technology? Is it, or has it been used? Is it? Or is it
the
being used
resin
someplace
technology is being used at Pease. So a lot of times we piggyback off of what's being done at Pease, because Pease and Wurtsmith have gone sort of neck and neck on getting things up and running.
And-
right
and that
now, they
resin-
went with the resin technology.
And that resin technology removes some of those other contaminants besides the two major?
I'm sure it probably does. I'm not a resin expert.
Yeah, absolutely
But the
does.
carbon does too.
It's better than the GAC.
But there is removal.
Yeah, the GAC does
Yes.
too.
Let me ask, I'm sorry. Let me ask the RAB members, what other questions do you have pertaining to the GAC system or even back to the supplemental side?
Before you do that, I was gonna let you know that, hopefully in the fall, we're gonna have a presentation and we will have various people talk the different technologies. So, and I think that would be very helpful for all.
Fall like in August, or fall like September?
Fall like September, October. I guess it's fall up here. It's still
Michigan,
midsummer in
yeah.
San Antonio.
Oh, up here, August is fall.
Oh, now you start to sound like.
Hey, we had snow in May.
Well, yeah, I know. Okay. But I was just gonna let you know, sort of head off that one, but yes, we do want to talk the different technologies. And I passed that one around. That was a Bentonite type mat material. And we're talking about maybe, there's some different ideas with that. And I'll be talking with Bob, because one thing we're gonna start having is a lot more frequent BCT meetings, and we'll be working a lot closer together as we move forward on this, especially with these interim measures. But as I said, once again, you know, going back to the first one, yes, these issues are being worked out, and it's jointly with the township, OWA, and the Air Force. And special appreciation to OWA and the township. And you know, once the easement's approved, then yes, we'll have the manhole, and they'll just cut that 36-inch RCP and set that precast manhole system in. And then they're getting a big enough one that can handle when we get it up to 1,000 GPM. So that's the reason we couldn't use the old existing one that was, you know, we don't want to put that in with that much water going into it in the future.
We have a question with Mr. Moss.
It's about the GACs and the systems, and you had made a comment earlier regarding changing out of the carbon, I think, out of the benzene or the other emission stream.
The FTO2?
Yeah. So
Where we only have 2 vessels there, we're gonna
Right.
look at our contractor, which is Bay West on that one. We're looking at probably trying to tie resin into that, so that will last a lot longer than 80 days
So
for change out.
where are the spoils going when you change out the activated charcoal? Where are the spoils of that
They
unit
take
going?
it back with them.
Take it back with them to Detroit, I don't understand what that means. What does
When
that
they
mean?
bring in the new,
Yeah.
reactivated, they take the old.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so
They're
it's taken back.
responsible for
Yes.
outside of the area, or is it a restricted?
If they're based out of Detroit, they're taking it back to Detroit. You know, or wherever they're located.
So is there a Bay West representative here?
The carbon's been coming from Pennsylvania, they've been getting it, and then they take it back, and they actually take the carbon and regenerate it. They use it, they destroy the contaminants.
Okay,
that
so
are-
so we're not regenerating here on site.
Oh, no, no,
Yeah,
no.
okay.
2 or 3 meetings ago, that topic was brought up, and it was out of state. I thought it was in the south, but I can't remember where it was, but it was not Michigan.
Okay.
Okay.
I was just curious.
Wherever they're out.
Would
of.
Canada
Yeah,
take it, you
exactly.
think, or not?
So
Calgon-
let's go to Bob Delaney if we could. Go ahead, Bob.
Calgon's the company that brings the carbon, and they take it back, and they either reuse it or they totally destroy it, whatever, however they can. You know, their preference is to be able to reactivate it, make it usable again. So that's usually what they do.
So they cook it.
They cook it. And I'm not sure how it works with PFAS. It's a different animal than most of the stuff that I've worked with, but yeah, they're trying to make it so they can reuse it.
What other questions from the RAB members?
Just to finish it up, hopefully the next RAB meeting will have ribbon cutting ceremony down there. Celebrate that and look forward to the expansions, what we're going to do with the next. So, thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, if we move to slide 19, Chris Bush has a presentation. The co-chairs met together, and one of the items that they pulled together, we discussed this the last meeting, was kind of a meeting standards document. Of course, our operating procedures talk about how these meetings flow, but it doesn't go into a great level of detail. And so that meeting standards document, which I'll send out to the full RAB here in the next few days, just indicates some specific practices to make the meetings work as effectively and efficiently as they can. One of the things that was suggested by the co-chairs was to have as a standing agenda item a technical presentation by the regulatory partners. So this one relates to MDHHS, and then next we'll deal with MDQ's presentation. Bob Delaney has a presentation as well. So that's kind of how you see this fit into this particular agenda. But Chris, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit. There's a little bit of a typo. We're not looking to contain the fish, but checking on the contamination in them. So we're keeping an eye on the contaminants that can get into fish, and then how those contaminants, the amounts that are in the fish, how that applies to the MDHHS Eat Safe Fish program. That is the name of our fish advisory program these days. So I'm not going to get too much into the detail of how this program works. I'm more interested in telling you a little bit of the detail for how it is working for this community. But let me point you to a website where we have much of the information about how this work is done, and also where you can get data and our fish consumption guidelines. That's at michigan.gov/ and then as one word, Eat Safe Fish. When we are sampling fish for this program to consider any consumption guidelines we're going to be giving to people or to communities, we want to get a good sample size of fish. You get one fish, and what does it tell you? It tells you what's in that one fish. You get a bunch of fish, that gives you more of a trend. So really, the good sample size that we want, that we prefer, is at least 10 fish of a species that we're interested in. Now, we can use as few as 5 fish for that, for making our advice, but the statistics get stronger if you have a larger population in which you're doing those statistics. So 10 fish of legal size in that specific species are very helpful. So we have done some sampling previously in water bodies in the area, certainly Clark's Marsh. We have not resampled there because we need to fix, if it's possible to fix, the situation at Clark's Marsh, and then we'll see how that affects the contamination in the fish. Right now, the do not eat for any species in Clark's Marsh Pond still stands. In Van Etten Lake, these are the samples that have occurred recently this year. The DEQ works with the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR. They go out oftentimes together, sometimes it's just the DNR because it's the DNR equipment, to get samples of fish. And they might electroshock in the water, and the fish are stunned and come up to the surface, and they are grabbed then. They might have nets for certain fish. They may use a hook and line. It's whatever's going to work for them in that certain situation. I leave it up to those people. I enjoy fishing. I don't eat fish, but I enjoy the thrill of certainly a bluegill getting on the end of the line. It feels like a monster when it fights. So, Van Etten Lake. This year, and I apologize for not having this in a slide. If it's preferable, I can write this up afterwards, but it will also be captured in our video. Van Etten Lake, they caught 10 pike. They caught 10 walleye, and let me point out that walleye have been tested before here, and the mercury in the walleye is the driver for our advice there. But we'll see what this new sampling says, if there's any change to that. They also caught 6 black crappie and 5 rock bass. The rock bass have been tested previously too, but our statewide mercury advice is the driver for the consumption guidelines that we provide there. Now, people have asked us, well, we want perch caught from Van Etten also. And when the DNR and the DEQ did their work, no perch were willing to be caught. So there is a plan to go back out later this summer and see if they can catch it at that time. So those are the species that we've recently gotten in for Van Etten Lake. The Oscoda downstream of the Foot Dam was also sampled. We got 10 Atlantic salmon from there. They have not been sampled before. We've got 10 smallmouth bass, and I think we may have gotten a few of those before. I will point out that the non-migratory species in the lower Oscoda, such as the smallmouth bass, MDHHS recommends a do not eat guideline for the you can call them the resident fish, the fish that are in the river year-round, non-migratory. And that's due to, we saw some very varied PFOS concentrations. PFOS is the specific chemical that really builds up in fish. And we were seeing that in the non-migratory species when we first started doing sampling around this area. And with that variation, it tells us that there's something not quite right in the river system. Let's be protective and recommend not eating these fish until we know more. And we're hoping that this smallmouth bass sampling will help us inform more. It's possible that later on this summer we will be sampling bluegill and pumpkin seed near the river mouth. And that sampling could inform us and guide us as whether we need to collect other species near the river mouth. For instance, people have suggested that we sample walleye and steelhead. We have done that in the past, but those are generally migratory species. Certainly the steelhead are, the walleye are generally migratory, though some may stay in the river longer than others. Currently, the consumption guidelines that are on walleye and steelhead are derived using both fish that were taken from the river and fish that were taken from Lake Huron, since that connects to the river. For walleye, the consumption guidelines are driven by dioxins in the fish. And for steelhead, it's the PCBs that are in the fish. Now, all of these guidelines have just recently been brought up to date so that you have the current information at the Eat Safe Fish website. I apologize for not having paper copies of those. It was only about a week or two ago that we updated the website, I believe. We are also planning on sampling fish from Cedar Lake later this summer, so we can understand if there's an issue there, and if not, that's great. So that's the information I wanted to give you as far as what's gone on for recent sampling, and there's probably going to be ongoing monitoring of the situation, and certainly after remedial actions have been taken, we want to make sure we see a good turnaround in the fish too. Tim?
All right, thank you. And I might see if you might coordinate with Brianne to maybe get some of those details that you were reading off of it, if you'd like those included in this.
Sure.
If we could shift now from the PowerPoint that we're in to the other PowerPoint that should be on your desktop. It's entitled MD Presentation, I believe.
Tim, excuse me, I don't mean to
Oh, I'm sorry.
interrupt, but
Yes,
I have
go
a
ahead.
question for
Yeah.
Chris. Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Based on the current, well, first let me say thank you publicly for coming coming in and making testing of fish sampling, getting it done, okay? Because we've been asking for a while, and I appreciate that, and thank you very much. Based on our current situation, I know that how the testing's been handled on the schedules is in a rotation of how the state does this area as opposed to another area. They kind of get the same thing everywhere they go, because that's how they're instructed to do it. Is there a way that we can kind of customize an annual sampling based on the circumstances that we're going through, so that we'll have ongoing annual data to see if we can remediate this issue and where we would remediate this issue? Because with data from 2011 and 2013 and 14 is what we were gauging everything on, but I'm publicly asking for an annual review to more of a customized, like the walleye. The walleye at the river mouth is something that's a major fishery for us in this community. We should be testing that on an annual basis based on our population and what they're catching and eating.
That's a good question, and I am not the one to answer it.
But it's
However,
a request.
Yes, I can bring your request back, and it would be even better to get it in writing from you.
Okay.
And also bear in mind these new data, when
Yes.
they come in, we can see how they compare to the data collected 2-3 years ago.
Good.
Just to see what kind of changes, if any, have happened over time, and then that can guide future sampling events, what we're aiming for and when we're aiming for it. So if you can get to me, perhaps in an email, what you're looking for, I will make sure it gets to the decision makers in our department and at State Health, and then it will probably be a multi-department discussion.
Okay, thank you.
And Tim, is just a quick follow-up. Is there not, someone found online a study done by those joint agencies you mentioned, DEQ, DHS, a white paper that was published in August of last summer, 17, that basically said Wurtsmith should be a annual sampled baseline contaminated site in the state for baseline decisions, basically like that. And that's my take on the report. And I was wondering if at a future time, or if you want to take a minute or less, to just let us know, is that a report and how is it being used within the departments?
My understanding is that was an update report to a white paper originally written in regard to the PFC issue, when it was called PFCs, and now it's called PFAS. And that has been provided to management and also is a public document. So it should, and that's probably how you, is that how you got it, Arnie?
Yes.
Okay. So that is out there. As far as the decisions made on that, those are not decisions that I am a part of. So I think that that probably needs to be directed to the management of the departments for that.
Okay, and Tim, I would suggest that maybe we make that an action item, if it's that important, if we could capture that.
Okay, I'll try to capture it and then get with you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, I know we're somewhat pressed for time. I neglected to mention earlier that the co-chairs, as they went through the agenda this afternoon, decided to add an additional 15 minutes so that we will conclude at 7:45 instead of 7:30. The intent there was to add additional time for public comment. We have a number of folks who've signed up already. But let's go to the MDEQ presentation. It is, it's not. Yeah, it's for the machine.
Oh. All right.
Slide 2.
All right, well, let's do it. All right, this is just updated
be on slide 4.
All right. This is just and they have the health advisory number. So this, when we get to the red, those are the areas where we know that we have contamination above those criteria for those chemicals. Again, you can see the levels based on colors that starting here, advisory or criteria started, and then going to black. Black is our required training area.
Chronic wasting.
They checked for those, and while they were at it, they took samples for PFAS chemicals to see what kind of abuse going on across the state. And then certain areas that are of special concern, like Wurtsmith, and Camp Grayling, those kinds of areas where we know there's more contamination. They went out to sing, we were getting here from those areas to see if there's a specific problem. And then we'll be compared against all the deer that are across the state. Next thing, home pilot test, down years ago. I'm not gonna get into that. You're interested, just talk to me afterwards. Surface water investigation, we're going out, we're sampling surface water all around the base and in various waters. We want to keep doing that to see how the surface water is responding to different remedial actions. Like we're gonna have this GAC on, is Van Creek gonna get better? Oscoda River gonna get better? What's the fluctuations? Where's the foam coming from? More of those kinds of things. We're trying to get a better picture of what's impacting water. Dispute resolution SSI. I'm really gonna make this really brief. I was going to talk a little bit more about that. So, as most of you know, we're in the grant that I get from, the state gets from the Department of Defense. There's if you can't understand something at my level and Matt's level, then it goes up the chain. It goes up 3 levels above us to try and work out where. So we had our first meeting in April 19th, first face-to-face meeting. We had multiple conversations. So there are 7 points that we were in disagreement with the Air Force. And a lot of those issues come really from national policy issues from DOD and from our interpretation of what we need to enforce. We're the regulator, we need to regulate. And so we've been trying to work those out. The first thing one of the things that we can work on immediately that there was enough common ground on right now was the supplemental site inspection that Matt and Beth have talked about. So I don't need to really get into that other than to say that they agreed to make some changes, some important changes that we asked for in that investigation. So we made progress there. The other issues are still out there that need to be worked out. They're being worked out clear in Washington, and even the governor's office is involved in trying to help work this out. So it's full. The whole team is engaged trying to get these things worked out. Plume modeling, and you heard about the hydrant report. Well, we also have a model of the groundwater flow, and we are looking at how we used to have groundwater, drinking water wells out here, and we know how much water those were taking in all the time to feed the system, because it's always reported to the state how much water they pumped. So they were pumping a certain amount of water. We can put that into our groundwater models, and we can see where the capture zones are. I'm not going to try and explain capture zones to you, but Matt showed you a map up here today with a bunch of lines and stuff going to certain points. Those are capture zones. And so what you can do is you can figure out where the groundwater was captured, lay it over the plumes, and so you can see were they sucking up PFAS or not. So we can look back in time to see if they were capturing the plumes. And then we have a hydrogen report that says that in the municipal system there was PFAS. So those two together will give us an idea of how the people living on the base might have been impacted in the town. So that modeling report has right now gone out to a professor, a hydrogeologist at MSU to review, to make sure, because this will form the basis of asking for health studies and stuff like that. So the department wants to make absolutely sure that it's peer reviewed, that it will stand up to any kind of scrutiny. Then the last thing is there's a vapor intrusion investigation. We're working with the Defense Department on the Air Force on this issue. In that, a lot of the chemicals they had vaporized to get into your basement or into your home. And so we're working to get a work plan so they can go out and check to see if there's anybody getting exposed to vapors. That's it.
Great. All right. Thank you. A lot of information there, and certainly a lot of follow-up discussion that could emerge from that. But I want to not lose the critical portion of this meeting, which is the public comment period.
Can I ask a question first?
Yes, sir, Mr. Maxwell.
When you're talking about the health advisory levels, you're talking about what's current and not what the CDC is recommending?
I'll let Chris speak to that. That's a health department call on fish advisories and drinking water advisories and foam.
Right, the health advisory levels that we're talking about are the EPA numbers of 70 parts per trillion. We do not have a copy of the report that is being alluded to from the CDC as far as the possible levels being lower. So we have asked to get that report in a timely manner, and I think that a lot of states are very much interested in that, so that we can use appropriate guidance and be all working at this as one team throughout the country, and not having, as I think that you have seen in other presentations and in other venues, different states having different screening levels or different criteria and addressing this differently.
But didn't the CDC recommend it down to 12?
I do not know what their numbers are for sure.
They announced 6 times lower is all it's been word out of ATSDR, but.
So if I could, I will advance us forward here. I know we've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll shift back to that original presentation we were running through, slide 21. Let me just give a brief RAB business update. The previous minutes from the 18 April meeting were sent out as final on Monday. I sent that out along with a few documents for tonight. The current action items, the two co-chairs got together today for a couple hours to run through the action items. Let me suggest I display those after the public comment period to preserve as much time as possible. But a suggestion that I would have is that I send the revised version of that out to the full RAB as well. So I'll defer to the co-chairs on that. Getting some
Right, and we asked that some strong review of those. I don't want to be in a position of saying, yeah, that one action item has been answered, or that action item is fully documented to the way that the requester submitted it. I want that coming from my community RAB members to tell me, yes, that one's okay to take or close or to keep it open,
so
and so forth.
I'll send that out to the full group so y'all can look through that in detail. Upcoming RAB meeting dates, we have 15 August as our next meeting, and then a proposal that 14 November would be the next meeting thereafter as well. Let's move on, or I'm sorry, still on this slide here, we have an...
Excuse me, Tim?
Yes, sir.
August and then November?
15 August was the
What
suggestion.
happened,
and 14
maybe sooner?
Well, what we talked about was this. October is a high-risk month to travel for any federal employee because of continuing resolution budgets. They're not allowed, so it's a high risk. That was one thing that we talked about. And we did talk about, at some point, going to quarterly. So this kind of early November, late October was in a discussion.
If EPA comes out with this report and it turns out that the HA level is going to go down, then I think that warrants a meeting sooner than November. If, okay, I'm just saying if. So can we have it
We'll revisit
open
it at the
after August?
Right.
Would that?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
that's
but I
what
don't
we're
want to
planning.
pin down a November meeting if new information is going to be coming out at that point that may warrant a meeting. I think it deserves.
And what I'll suggest is that we just list that as a tentative date right now as a placeholder for our schedules, but then adjust as needed. Does that work? Great. Okay, so a little update on items that were added to the information repository, which is right here, and the administrative record. So moving on to that next slide, the public comment period. I'm actually moving on to slide 23. So public comment period, again, I appreciate the fact that 8 folks have signed in on the public comment sign-up sheet. Just a reminder that you can come up here to deliver your comments. You'll have 3 minutes to do so. Also at this back table, the round table right back behind here, are some sheets that if you would prefer to write out your comment, you can certainly do that as well. The first of 8 individuals that are signed up is Mr. Jim Davis, an alternate community RAB member. Mr. Davis. Oh, no, okay. All right. Very brief comment. Okay, how about Jean Curban? And if you could hold that, if you don't mind, it just helps with the YouTube. Exactly. And then you can drop it.
Okay. My name is Gene Curban. I'm the president of the Salvo River chapter of the Michigan Steelheaders and of Lake Huron Sport Fishing, and a member of NOW. The fact that the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base and surrounding area is such a hot spot, we feel that annual fish sampling would be the most proactive action to protect the health of the citizens and visitors to the area. Fish consumption and sampling for PFAS around the Wurtsmith site is a human health protection issue. We are asking for annual, yearly testing of game fish which people target and consume, and also to include yearly testing of white-tailed deer, native and migratory game birds which people consume as well. I know that it had been mentioned by Chris a little bit earlier that the Eat Safe Fish handout or the flyer was just updated, but it was updated with old data because you just collected the fish early part of May and you still don't have the new data, so it's old information and the new publication with the new pictures.
That's how it works.
Well, unfortunately it should. But if we can possibly, we are requesting a sampling being done more often, yearly, bi-yearly, but it needs to be done more often than 4 or 5 years. And also the results being published, the new results, not a reprint with old data and a new cover photo. And we are also requesting the RAB to create an action item on this issue.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Miss Irene Dunn, an alternate community rep member. Okay. Okay, well, thank you. Let's see, and is this Tom Powder, I believe?
I don't think that's seems like a pretty popular answer. I'm Tom Ponder. I'm a Loud Drive resident, seasonal, live in San Antonio, and spent 5 months up here. I was stationed at Wurtsmith 8182. Drank the water, so did my family. Don't know that we have any problems from that. We'll be watching. I mainly want to give a shout out to the township. I spent a large share of my adult life on these Air Force bases, and this base, if you've never had a chance to go back to other bases, is a shining example of how to do it right. I mean, this base housing area is fantastic. You go to K.I. Sawyer and see what they got up there. It's ghetto. This whole base is really looks good. This facility you're in, I mean, they've done a super job. A guy that I want to particularly name is our retiring superintendent, Bob. Bob's been here through it all. He's the only one. We've got elected officials that come and go, but Bob's been here for the whole thing. And I think he deserves way more credit than he's getting for what goes on here. So I wanted to say that. But appreciate that, that it seems like we're getting some action. We're getting things done. It seems like there's still some disconnects. Those of us that live here and you tell us that they didn't sample perch in Manhattan Lake and you didn't sample walleye in the river, anybody that lives here and fishes, that's what we do here. I mean, we catch walleye. That's what they're out there tonight. My neighbor's probably down there. He does. That's what they fish for in the river. That's the best eating fish in the river. You're gonna catch some old bass that don't taste no good. You're gonna catch some walleye. So in the same way in Manhattan Lake, the best eating fish in Manhattan Lake is the perch. That's why people catch them and eat them. You wanted samples? My neighbor's got 20, 30 pounds of perch fillets in his freezer that he's not really sure if they should feed to their grandkids, you know? So the information's there, and it seems like we're getting it corrected, but there seems like there's still some disconnects. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your comments. All right, Mr. John Nordine from Oscoda Township.
Yeah, my comments are more of a point of clarification. I've heard tonight Air Force representatives say a couple times that the focus or their focus or emphasis is on health health or drinking water on the west side of the lake as opposed to the east side, which is in question a bit. But saying emphasis implies that there's other peripheral action being done or attention being given to other areas like the east side of the lake, and there doesn't seem to be any. So my point of clarification is just by saying we're emphasizing on, I've seen it done with human health as opposed to the environment. Emphasis is on human health, which implies action or attention being given to the environment, but I don't see any in effect. So it's just a clarification of the wording of that, and correct me if I'm wrong. Just that one clarification.
So it sounds like you see, if I understand you correctly, the terminology would be sole focus.
Yeah, sole focus, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm driving at.
Okay. Great. Well, let me just ask real quick for any clarification or comment from the RAB members present on that topic.
One thing, the CERCLA process that they're operating under will call for ecological risk assessment if ecological issues, and the state's pressing the Air Force to do that, and so that's, but it hasn't been a central focus right now because of the human consumption of fish and water. But you're right, and we've been pushing on the fish issue also as a human health risk problem that we'd like them to address more quickly.
I appreciate that. I don't want to be impatient by any means, unduly impatient. I appreciate your opinion and clarification on that.
Thank you.
I have a question then. It brings up, this man wants to build 2 hangars and has to do an environmental impact study, but we have this whole issue and we can't get an environmental assessment done? Why? Simple. Why?
Sometimes
I'll ask Matt. Why? Wait.
That's outside of the circular process.
Okay, so, and this
Now,
goes.
that's probably being required as part of the building process.
And if you could speak up.
Well, but my point is that we have known contaminants, AFFF that's in our aquifer. We're all asking to know what's going on in our environment outside the fence line. We clearly have sites identified inside the fence line, but outside the fence line, an environmental assessment would clearly give us some areas in which to attack our remediation. We clearly have citizens who are very concerned that their drinking water is contaminated. I haven't heard a word about the school tonight, about the testing over at the transportation building. We haven't come up with a solution of the hot spot across the street. We have an environmental assessment that needs to take place. We're requesting an environmental assessment. Would that be an agreeable statement by the RAB? Or is there anybody who doesn't want an environmental assessment? MPART sitting in the back of the room. Is an environmental assessment not a requirement, but would that help assess the circumstances at Wurtsmith or Grayling or Kent County or? It's not part of the CERCLA process.
Not here.
So
We're still in the SSI phase, and from that we'll move on in to other.
So if
I'm going to request an
let me just
action
jump in
item.
real quick, if I could.
Sure.
Put it in
If
as
I
an
understand,
action item.
if I understand Matt's
Yeah,
comments.
let's do that.
Okay.
If I understand Matt's comments, that Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act process, which includes that site inspection and some follow-on phases, essentially produces an assessment of the environment. Is that essentially what you're saying, Matt?
Through the dirt process.
Right. So maybe not that specific name associated with it, but
Let's put it
that
as
is
an
the outcome.
action item, and I will get something official from
Just
the
to-
Air Force
right,
attorneys.
just to
That
explain.
way, because that way we can address this issue once and for all.
Okay,
that'd be great.
let's turn,
And I think
let's
that's
turn,
what we need to
let me
do.
jump in. We're gonna get a
I
Bob
was just,
Delaney.
I was just gonna say that, to understand it a little more simply, under the CERCLA process, they have to do a human risk assessment, so that will be done in the future, in a future phase. At the same time, they need to do an ecological risk assessment. So, because there are obviously impacted, the environment and species and stuff like that, so they'll have to do that analysis as well. And they've done it on other parts of the base already for different contaminants.
Tim?
Yes.
I'd like to, did we finish on that topic?
If I actually will do a follow-up comment, but I don't.
Well, what I want to capture is Bob's answer, partial to yours. And you mentioned, and I don't know if it was picked up by the mics, that you said, when talking about the Clark's Marsh, and you said something about the health impacts of basically the water coming out of Clark's Marsh. And I would like to add, I think what you meant is out of Clark's Marsh into the Oscoda River. And the DEQ has data and sampling that they've been doing along the Oscoda River of the plumes along it. And this brings up the issue of, and I'd like to make it an action item, that your data on that regard goes to point with your 12 parts per trillion, Rule 57, and you've shared that amount on a map. But it also is, that's a source of contamination that's going into our fish in the Oscoda River, and that should have a status of health effect impacts, and that would trigger a site for potential CERCLA remediation if there is a contamination and a threat to human health through fish consumption in the river.
Yeah, that's what the fish advisories are all about, health and risk.
But the fish advisory, the way it's printed and published, is a study to find out the worst contamination and limit and advise the public how to limit their consumption to protect for that maximum. But Chris even mentioned, that's the maximum that's printed on the document. And there is an analysis that's done by the state that does calculate what the PFAS contamination is in those fish, but it's just not publicized. It's way in the depth of the report. And that has to be brought up to the level, it may not be 2 portions per month. The PFAS, and that's mercury, PFAS may be 6 portions. So it's not as bad. You can eat more based on PFAS, but you're still being subjected to a measured amount of PFAS contamination by the people who eat that fish.
So I've attempted to capture an action on that. It sounds like some continuing conversation. John has been super patient with us. I'm going to turn right back to him right after Bob Tajer makes a comment real quick.
Yeah, I would just like to ask the question that I think that's kind of brought up, is people are concerned on the east side of Van Etten Lake when we're going to get to it, saying where that stuff is coming from. I mean, plain language. I'd like to know, when you show the maps from the DEQ, showing large plumes over on the east side on Loud Drive and that, when is it going to be said that the Air Force is responsible for plumes going across that lake?
So Bob, your
That would
comment
come
is
when
that-
you get to the RIFS
Yeah,
phase.
and how far away are we from getting to that phase? Years?
That's yet to be determined.
So Bob, your comment is essentially the same as Mr. Gaines. What's the source of contamination, and where's the responsibility lie for it, essentially?
And what he
And
added
when we can
was,
start getting
what
fixed.
What kind of a time frame
Right.
could we reasonably expect? And it wouldn't have to be September of 20 20.
Right.
It wouldn't have to be that exact, but at least some kind of a timeline.
Okay.
Here,
So,
the reality is
I'm gonna-
that they could start an RI immediately if they had the money. They had proposed to do an RI in 2016, remedial investigation in 2016, but it didn't come about. They did the two site inspections instead. So
Okay.
so money is the holdback.
All right, so let me shift back to John. Quick comment before we move on to Dave Wynn.
Appreciate it. Kind of ties in here. Back to my point on patience or impatience. I can be patient if I see real action in other areas. But it appears that the Air Force just hides behind the circle process. And it's frustrating. And I hope that's not the case. And if it is the case, I just hope everyone's letting their conscience guide, and I hope their conscience can bear it if that truly is the case, because it's very frustrating to have that perception. Whether my perception's reality, I don't know, but that's what I'm asking
Okay.
tonight.
Well, I appreciate you making comments. Okay, next topic, next commenter is Dave Wynn.
My name is Dave Wynn, and I'm a resident on Van Etten Lake. I have two quick questions. My first question is for the airport authority. All of the new hangars and the tear up of all the airport and the runway and stuff, where's that material going?
Well, the stuff will be stored on the base.
So contaminated material is going to be stored on the base.
We're gonna be taking it from one spot to another, but it's not gonna leave the base, no.
Is there something wrong with that picture?
Well, what do you want us to do with it?
Pennsylvania.
Canada.
I want to see that somewhere where it's not.
Now be serious. Now be serious.
You're literally going to
Think what you said.
up and recontaminate the area, right? It could be.
I'm gonna keep us with, I'm
I guess the question is-
I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna keep us with the one public comment. Go ahead.
Okay. I guess my question is this something that MPART and DEQ should be involved with in order to monitor this, to find out where that material is and if it's actually contaminating other areas?
That's why we're doing the study.
Right.
That's why we're doing the study.
By law, they can move the material to another location of like contamination. So, if they tear it down, they keep it on site, and they move it to another place.
But that's being monitored by state people, right?
Yeah, they have to get approval from us to dispose
second
of that
question is-
contaminated stuff.
My property is on the east side of the Van Etten Lake, okay? Is there any, I've heard comments earlier, in the future, is there any testing, any further well testing gonna be done over in that area? By the
Well,
DEQ or by the state?
yeah, we're actually putting in some new monitoring wells. One of the difficulties with residential wells is we don't know how deep they are in the aquifer. So it makes it confusing to try and figure out where the plumes really are and how bad they are.
I have paperwork on my well, so I can give you that.
Yeah, well, that's helpful, and I'd like to actually add some of those residential wells into our data.
I would really appreciate that.
Because we went through all of them, and they were just, most of them were really bad or didn't have the depth or whatever, so we.
So Bob, it sounds like you might wanna catch up
Sure.
with Mr.
Let's
Lord.
talk
Is there an
afterwards.
action item that says that is gonna be put in the next 3-4 months?
How's that, the wells?
Is there an action item of when those wells can be tested?
Well, the current wells are going in right now, and they will be tested 2 weeks after they're installed, properly developed, and they will be tested right then. So you're looking at results in maybe 2 months out by the time you drill it and go to the lab. Residential wells, we haven't been, we had limited money, so we've been going out to the areas where we didn't know what the levels were or where people weren't getting alternate water, because we're trying to protect those to make sure they're, and so we've focused in back at Cold Bath and River Road, because those people weren't getting, they didn't have a chance to get alternate water. So we haven't sampled in the area on the east of Van Etten Lake, probably where you live, just because people can get alternate water, and so with our limited funds, we're trying to protect the other people.
So I'm gonna.
Depends on where you're at, I don't know.
I'm gonna suggest a sidebar conversation
Yeah.
between the two of y'all.
Okay.
Then after
Yeah.
the meeting
Be glad to
concludes,
talk
if that
to you.
works, Bob. Okay, thank you very much, sir. And now, I believe it's Garrett Ellison. Was it? Okay, great. All right. Mr. Tony Spagnola.
That's actually,
Oh, okay.
I'm doing it.
Great, all right, you can do it from right there.
Okay. This is Tony Spaniola, and he's watching, via YouTube, and gave us public comment through me. So, as a person whose family owns property in the zone of concern for PFAS contamination, I ask as an action item that the Assistant Air Force Secretary John Henderson and Assistant Defense Secretary Lucian Niemeyer be requested to meet in person with impacted citizens in the Oscoda area. Because the Assistant Secretaries are responsible for policies directing impacting PFAS remediation in our area, a first-hand view might help them to understand that the Air Force's cookie-cutter remediation approach is inadequate because it fails to take into account the fact that Wurtsmith is bounded by public water bodies and fisheries. A first-hand view would further put them in a better position to submit more realistic budget requests to Congress.
Thank you. Let me just check in with the RAB members first on that. So it sounds like a request, the Assistant Air Force Secretary and Assistant Secretary of Defense to meet with impacted citizens in the Oscoda area. Any comment from the?
That will be forwarded on up to Dr. Termuth. So we will take that into consideration, forward that on up for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Would you like me to capture that as an action or?
Yes, as an action item.
Got it. Okay. Before, we just have 3 minutes left here real quick. So I wanted to display, if we have a second, could you pull up the Excel document? It's the action item tracker. I just wanted to convey real quick a few of these actions. That should be coming up here in just a second, but the co-chairs met together today, went through the action item tracker, and it's challenging as a full group to go through and manage these action items, specific action items. Easier with a smaller group. So they went through, they identified some that looked like they could be closed. For example, action item 16 was to modify FY18 project summary to add out-of-cycle funding requests and other projects. That is one of the items in your packet today. It will also be addressed under another action item. They also discussed an action item 18 pertaining to integrating CERCLA and NEPA processes with Forest Service. The discussion was to close that and the comment that the Air Force and Forest Service have a 5-year memorandum of agreement, which they've been in conversations about this topic, and it would find its way into that document as well. Also, let's see, we had an action item about informing RAB members about the effectiveness of a resin exchange system. That was addressed somewhat in the discussion we had today. They closed that as an action item, but converted it to a future agenda item for the fall so that we can address that. Briefly, real quick, quite a few action items remain open and will be discussed by the co-chairs as they do preparatory meetings for the next RAB. Again, I'll send out this action item tracker to the RAB members as well. Does that work for folks? Okay, a lot of words there.
I have a very specific action item that was due in April, and that's responsibility for the plumes in the other side of the ensemble where the fires were fought. I haven't heard any discussion of that.
I believe there may have been a question and answer pertaining to that. Is that?
I think what we still need to get is a official Air Force response on that from our attorneys. There's been some discussion. In fact, there was some email traffic, but as far as a formal written, I do not have that yet. So I still owe that to you, Bill. That's the reason that one's still open. Good. So it's not forgotten. And you and a couple others have asked that question, and yes, it will be resolved.
So it's on
Okay.
there? Okay, okay.
I believe it is, yes, sir. Okay, a lot to cover. Let me ask the co-chairs real quick. We are at the time that y'all had set to conclude the meeting. I know there's more conversation we can have, comments to be made. Shall we continue on, or shall we wrap up now?
Are there other comments?
I think just closing comments now.
I think that would be the next step. The final step would just be any closing remarks from the co-chairs.
I have one question on the foam, because if you set a pilot test for the foam, does that mean you don't have any results yet on the foam?
No, we know what the foam's composed of as far as the PFAS in it. The question is, the pilot test is to see if we can do kind of an interim action where we go out and collect the foam at certain times when it builds up a lot. So we're contracting to have somebody go out and do that several times to see which method's going to work, or if it's not going to work, it's not practical, or is it practical to do? Should we focus in on certain beaches or certain areas? They're going to try and figure out. Nobody's done this before, okay? This is not like we have any guidance on how to do this or anything. So we're working with our consultants and contractors to try and figure out, well, what might work, and we're going to go try those things. We've got this issue at other places too, so this information will be helpful to see if it works.
So you mean you have never tested the foam before? Because in
No,
Grand Rapids, yeah.
we've tested it chemically. We're figuring out about how to clean it
Oh,
up.
got it, okay.
Okay, so let me suggest 1,000 other things that we could cover here, but let me make the recommendation that we move to just any closing remarks from the co-chairs, and then have some time for individuals to
I
ask
have a
questions.
request before that, if we may. We have MPART in the back of our audience, and those are representatives who are at the EPA meeting and may have an update for the community. If we give them the opportunity to speak for a couple of minutes, I'd be more than happy to hear that, if that's something that they would be willing to do, or if the party, the council would be willing to allow that for a couple of minutes before we go into closing statements. I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Matt, Arnie, what else?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, yeah,
They
if
took
we
the
could
time to
take
come,
a couple of
so-
minutes. Yes, ma'am. And if you could do it from here, that would be great.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving us just one more moment before you end your meeting tonight. I just want to give you an update. Many of you know that Carol Isaacs, who is the head of MPART, named by the governor, as well as the Michigan DEQ director, Heidi Grether, attended the EPA summit about 2 weeks or so ago now. And they were very engaged there with the EPA leadership, as well as with leadership across the rest of the country on the issue. In short, they did a couple of things in the couple of days while they were there. One of the things that they did is, as Chris has alluded to, they did request the data from the ASTDR, EPA, DOD information for our states, so that we could see what that data is, so that we could share that data, obviously, with all of our communities, and so that our experts here in state, along with our local and federal partners, can be more informed and make our own assessments based off of that information. That request was made directly to top leadership of all of those departments, and we are of the understanding that that information will come. We are waiting for the timeline on when that information will come, and we are actively advocating to receive that information as soon as possible. So I just wanted to reiterate that we take that information really seriously, and we expect to see that information come at some point very soon. The other thing that we did is we spent quite a bit of time with our congressional delegation there in Washington, and I'm happy to say that our entire delegation, and obviously we've got representatives of our delegation staff here who are always here at these meetings, but our entire statewide congressional delegation is extremely supportive of our efforts to not just hold accountable entities who need to be held accountable here in this state, but also are extremely supportive of trying to work together to make sure that we can draw down any additional funding for our communities like here in Oscoda, as well as others across the state where we need more money to be able to do a lot of these cleanup efforts that we've been talking about tonight. Finally, I'll just say that one of the things that became very clear to us while our team was there in DC is that this is obviously a national issue, and other states are dealing with similar issues to what we're dealing with here in Oscoda. One thing became very clear, which is that Michigan is way out in the forefront on this issue. A lot of other states pulled our folks aside to say that they are watching Michigan very closely. They're watching the actions here very closely. They are very interested in how we're able to solution through this issue in the meantime, as well as long-term solutions. And so they're also offering their support to us in the way of their experts in other states across the country who are constantly in conversations with folks like Chris and Bob and others back in Lansing and out to Washington, who are all talking about issues like foam, who are all talking about issues like what we do on our inland lakes and streams. They're all talking about issues with fish and wildlife and deer. And so, so if anything, I would just say that that was a really nice reiteration to our team that what we're doing here, the conversations we're having here at the RAB and during our community meetings, are conversations that are exactly at the central point of this issue nationally. So, so that was also interesting to hear. And finally, if I could just say that the governor and in part all of our corresponding department agencies from the DEQ to the DHHS, all the way to MDAR, to agriculture, natural resources, all of our local partners that have been engaged on this issue. One thing, and as well as our federal partners, the EPA, DOD, all of these partners are entities in which we have been engaging with on every single business day, and quite a bit on the weekends, I have to say. And we reiterated while we were in Washington that we would appreciate that continued support. We received that reiteration from those entities, and so we are confident in the direction that we're heading here. I'll just also say one more thing, which is that obviously we've got dispute resolution happening between the state and the Air Force. We are obviously actively engaged in those conversations, and the administration at the state level will not rest until we are able to see some remedy that is acceptable to our community here, as well as to our leadership team. So we are constantly working towards that goal, and that is our goal that we focus on every single day. So I appreciate the opportunity to just share that with you, and I thank you for the time.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Tim,
Let me
follow up.
let me suggest we move into some closing comments, but I defer to the co-chairs on how to proceed.
Okay, lead off. Okay. The lead off, thank you for that update. Just two things. I didn't hear a mention of from that EPA study about the regional meetings in the end of July in Michigan. Can you give us a quick?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The regional EPA meetings, the regional offices, and there's going to be one in Michigan the end of July. Can you give us any details about?
So one of the things that the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt had talked about during the EPA summit is that the EPA does not just want to have a summit in Washington, but that they also want to visit other states across the country who are experiencing PFAS issues. And so the EPA is coordinating with their counterparts at the state level across the country to organize some sort of localized summits to talk about the issue. I think July was one thing that they talked about. That has not been a confirmed date yet. It will, it's my understanding, happen at some point this summer. So unless you got a special note from Mr. Pruitt, I don't know. I have not seen that confirmed date yet. I do understand that it will be this summer, though. So we obviously will make sure that all of you are aware of when that will be, and we look forward to the EPA coming into Michigan.
Okay, but in Michigan, okay. And the second thing is, today is an eventful date. The ATSDR, CDC, division of the CDC, has yesterday and today having public comment hearings, and one of the topics is the DoD ATSDR multi-site health studies, and 8 of them that were appropriated and funded by Congress and the President in the defense bill. And I'm asking, what's our state's position on whether or not Wurtsmith should be one of those 8, and what conversations have you had with the ATSDR?
Chris, do you have an update on that?
My understanding is that we really have been advocating to ATSDR to include Wurtsmith in the DoD study. So the study that is carried out for Department of Defense sites. So that is something that we feel would fit well for Wurtsmith. Now, the other sites in our state that we're working on right now are not DoD sites. They are guard sites, or they have a responsible party. So for those sites, we are looking into other avenues of how to get attention to people's concerns there. But for Wurtsmith, I know that our leadership has really been advocating for the consideration of Wurtsmith as included in that area.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, let me turn to the co-chairs for any closing comments.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and as it was reiterated, this is becoming quite prevalent everywhere. And I'll sort of close with the example of back in our home state of Texas. Reese has now all of a sudden come up on the radar with over 200 homes above the HA. And they're still trying to identify that. So yes, it is nationwide, and it is something that has to be addressed. So thanks for everyone coming out tonight, and we'll see you in August.
And Arnie.
I want to publicly thank the Oscoda Township and their board for paying for the broadcasting and videoing that you see the cameras here to document these discussions in full. And so they've paid for this one and the previous one. And they're using public monies to do that, so I appreciate that happening. As of right now, we do not have a commitment or a way of funding the next one. If you remember, the first one was funded by the fishing groups, the Lake Huron sports fishing and so forth.
Anglers.
And anglers. Well, no. Anyways, so we'd like your input on the worth of this. Please talk to your neighbors that are online. At last count, I know that there was at least 15 that were online, and that may seem like a small number, but the video has been last month's meeting video has been viewed over 220 times, so I want to throw that in. And so please give us some input, both the township and me and the RAB, community RAB, on that, because if we can't get public funding, then we've got to start looking for funding, because personally I think it's a great benefit to all the work that's being done by you and by the committee chairs here. So please get back to us.
Great.
Soon.
All right. Well, thank you all to the RAB members for your time. Thank you to those who attended for the time you devoted, for your engagement on this issue, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Good job, Tim.